The vault had defeated 12 engineers, 3 security firms, and a federal locksmith. Then Malcolm Vance, the black janitor, everyone had ordered to stay behind the yellow line, set down his mop, and quietly asked for 38 seconds. The boardroom erupted in laughter. Rebecca Whitmore, CEO of an $11 billion banking empire, almost had security remove him. But 38 seconds later, 6 steel bolts slammed open. Inside the untouched vault was no gold, no cash, just one black folder resting beneath a dead man's photograph. Rebecca opened it, went pale, and stared at the janitor. On the first page were 2 words, Malcolm Vance. It was 2:17 in the morning on the 3rd sublevel of the Whitmore Meridian Bank headquarters in Philadelphia, and a corridor that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades was suddenly crowded with engineers, lawyers, security officers, and members of the board. At the end of that corridor stood a door of solid steel, weighing close to 14 tons. A door with no electronic keypad and no ordinary keyhole, only a brass wheel, 3 mechanical levers, and a custom locking system built back in 1996. The vault had only just been discovered when a renovation crew tore down a false wall, and it belonged by every record to Thomas Whitmore, the bank's former chief executive who had died 11 months earlier without ever mentioning a FANJ par code. In 72 hours, the bank had brought in 12 mechanical engineers, 3 separate security firms, 1 former government locksmith, and a sound scanning device worth $240,000, and every single one of them had failed. The board was losing patience fast. Warren Pike, the chief financial officer, was pushing hard for an industrial thermal cutter, but Derek Sloan, the head of corporate security and a former federal investigator, warned that forcing the door might trigger a hidden mechanism designed to destroy whatever was inside. Rebecca Whitmore stood at the center of it all, in a charcoal suit she had not changed out of since a 9 o'clock meeting the previous morning. Arms folded, her patience worn thin by a day that had started with quarterly earnings and ended with a 14-ton mystery buried beneath her own headquarters. Every specialist in that hallway had a theory, and every theory had already failed, leaving behind nothing but scattered tool cases, coiled cables, and the particular exhaustion of men who had spent a full day insisting they were close to a blank breakthrough that never came. While the executives argued Malcolm Vance was mopping the floor behind the yellow security line, invisible to every person in that hallway, until an engineer spun the brass wheel and Malcolm suddenly stopped, muttering 2 words under his breath that nobody quite caught. "Too fast," he said, and when the engineer kept turning anyway, Malcolm checked his watch, listened to a barely audible click, and shook his head. Rebecca noticed the reaction immediately and asked, in a tone that could cut glass, whether he had something to say, and Malcolm answered simply that the man had passed the second gate 6 numbers too soon. The room went quiet for a moment before the lead engineer burst out laughing and asked what a janitor could possibly know about a bank vault built before he was born. Malcolm looked at the door for a long moment and told him he knew enough to understand. The man was listening for the wrong sound entirely, and the laughter that followed was loud enough that Graham Holt, the chairman of the board, ordered security to escort the janitor out. Malcolm bent down, picked up his mop, and as he turned to leave, he glanced once more at the vault and said almost to himself, 38 seconds. Rebecca asked him to repeat it, and Malcolm turned back to face her, explaining that if the system inside was still intact, he would need exactly 38 seconds to open it. Rebecca looked at his gray janitor's uniform, then at the 12 exhausted specialists standing helpless in front of the most stubborn door any of them had ever seen. And finally, she said, the 4 words that would change everything in that building: start the clock. Derek searched Malcolm first out of habit, as much as suspicion, and found no tools, no wires, nothing but a pair of worn rubber gloves that Malcolm removed and set carefully beside his mop. Rebecca noticed something strange about his bare hands' calluses on the fingertips that did not match years of scrubbing floors calluses, that looked instead like the marks left by decades of careful, deliberate touch. Malcolm asked for the sound scanner to be switched off, and when the engineers protested that the machine was their most advanced tool, he told them plainly that the machine was louder than the lock itself and that it had been drowning out the only sound that actually mattered. He placed 2 fingers against the cold brass wheel and asked for the clock to start, and at 38 seconds he began to turn it, not watching the numbers at first, but listening, his eyes half closed, as though he were tuning an and instrument only he could hear. At 34, he stopped and tapped a fingernail lightly against the metal casing, and at 29, he reversed direction entirely, prompting one engineer to insist he had already blown past the reset point, though Malcolm never answered him. At 24, he pressed his ear within 2 inches of the steel. At 19, he pulled the second lever with his left hand. And when Derek stepped forward, believing Malcolm was about to trigger some kind of deadbolt, Rebecca raised a hand and told him to wait. At 9 seconds, Malcolm closed his eyes completely. At 6, he turned the wheel exactly 1/4 turn, and at 3 seconds he whispered something so quiet, only the people nearest him could hear it. "Come on, old girl." At 1 second, 6 steel bolts released in a single motion, and at 0, the vault door swung outward, half an inch on its own weight. 38 seconds. Exactly. And the entire hallway fell into a silence so complete that someone's cell phone buzzing in a distant pocket sounded like an alarm. Malcolm did not celebrate or explain himself. He simply stepped back, slipped his rubber gloves back on, and reached for his mop, as though he had just wiped down a countertop, rather than defeated a machine that had humiliated the best specialists money could buy. Rebecca asked who he was, and Malcolm answered only that he was night maintenance, a title she clearly did not believe for even a second. Derek wanted him detained immediately, but Rebecca ordered the vault opened first, and what waited inside surprised everyone in that hallway. There was no gold, no stacks of currency, no government bonds, just a small 12-foot room with a single steel table at its center, holding an old photograph, an analog tape recorder, a sealed envelope, and one black folder. Rebecca stepped inside alone and studied the photograph first. A much younger Thomas Whitmore, standing beside 3 other men, 2 of them marked with a red X across their faces. The third turned slightly away from the camera. She opened the folder next, and on the very first page, printed in bold letters, were 2 words that made her blood run cold. Malcolm Vance. Rebecca turned slowly to look at the man still standing behind the yellow line mop in hand, and asked why his name was sitting inside her father's private vault. For the first time since he had walked into that hallway, the calm on Malcolm's face cracked, and he answered that her father had once promised him this vault would never be opened. When Rebecca pressed him further, asking why, then he had opened it himself. Malcolm looked past her shoulder directly at Graham Holt and said that someone in that room already knew exactly what was hidden inside. Rebecca sealed off the entire sublevel within minutes. Phones were confiscated, exits were locked down, and nobody was permitted to leave until Derek Sloan finished pulling every scrap of employment history he could find on the man calling himself a janitor. What came back was strange in a way that made Derek's skin crawl. Malcolm Vance had worked as a cleaner for 4 years and 7 months with no violations, no sick days, no criminal record, and almost no meaningful financial footprint of any kind. But before the year 2007, there was simply nothing there at all, as though the man had been born, fully grown at the age of 33. Rebecca turned back to the folder and found references to something called Project Blackstone, which was not a government program, but a private financial security division formed jointly by 7 major banks after a string of physical asset thefts in the late 1990s. Its purpose had been to design vaults that could not be forced open through conventional means to catch internal fraud before it spread and to test bank security systems by attempting to breach them from the inside. Malcolm had been one of 9 specialists in that division, operating under a single code name known only to a handful of people. Listener 4. Rebecca could hardly believe it, but Malcolm offered little in the way of explanation, saying only that he had never truly picked locks so much as listened for the difference between mechanical parts, a tired spring, a delayed latch, a gear, rotating less than half a millimeter out of alignment. To most people, those things were silent, but to Malcolm, they formed a kind of music that only he could hear. When Rebecca asked why a man with that level of skill was mopping floors in her bank, Malcolm answered simply that being invisible had always been safer for him than being seen. Derek then uncovered something far more disturbing, a record showing that Project Blackstone had been quietly dissolved in 2007, following a fire that destroyed its main archive, a fire that killed 3 specialists, left 2 others missing, and drove one to take his own life. Malcolm's own file carried a single chilling notation: presumed deceased. Rebecca stared at him and said that according to the bank's own records, he had been dead for 19 years. And Malcolm answered quietly that this had always been the idea. Graham Holt interrupted at that point, insisting the entire folder was likely fabricated and demanding Malcolm be handed straight over to the police. But Malcolm turned and looked at him with a familiarity that unsettled the room. "Still impatient, Graham," he said. And when Graham asked if they had ever met, Malcolm replied that Graham had simply been wearing a cheaper suit back then. He picked the photograph up off the table and pointed to the first man marked with an X, explaining that this man had died 3 days after discovering $14 million missing from client accounts. Then pointed to the second, marked man who had died only 2 days after placing a call to Thomas Whitmore himself. Finally, he looked directly at Graham and said that of everyone in that photograph, Graham was the only one still pretending he did not remember him at all. The story rewound 19 years back to a version of Malcolm Vance who wore a crisp white shirt and gray suit rather than a janitor's uniform, and who moved through banks, not through front doors, but through service entrances known only to a select few. He had been 32 years old, then sharp-eyed and quietly ambitious. The kind of man who read blueprints the way other people read novels, tracing every seam and joint until the whole structure made sense in his head before he ever laid a hand on it. In the closed world of vault security, Listener 4 had become something of a legend after 3 particular jobs. In Denver, a technical team spent 9 straight hours failing to locate a fault only for Malcolm to identify the broken latch inside 4 minutes. In Baltimore, cameras detected no intruder anywhere near a bond storage facility. Yet Malcolm traced the sound of a ventilation fan to a hollowed-out section of wall no one had thought to check. In Boston, he uncovered an employee quietly siphoning funds by shifting the recorded weight of storage boxes by less than 2 ounces at a time, a theft so small it had gone unnoticed for years. Word of his work spread quietly among a small circle of bank security chiefs, always through hushed recommendations rather than any public record, because the entire point of Project Blackstone was that its specialists left no trail behind them. Malcolm liked it that way. He had grown up watching his own father, a proud man, overlooked at every job he ever held, and he had promised himself early on that he would rather be underestimated than resented, that the quiet advantage of being dismissed was worth more than any title on a door. Thomas Whitmore hired Malcolm quietly, not to crack open vaults, but to explain why millions of dollars kept vanishing from managed client accounts. Malcolm worked alongside an auditor named Nathan Rourke and a security engineer named Philip Danner, and together the 3 of them uncovered a hidden system they came to call the Ghost Ledger. Money was never stolen directly. Instead, tiny fees were siphoned across thousands of separate transactions. $4.80 here, $17.20 there, $31.60 somewhere else. None of it large enough to trip a single alarm. But across 11 quiet years, the total climbed past $86 million, and whoever had designed the system clearly held board-level access to the bank's inner systems. Malcolm and his small team were 48 hours from delivering their evidence to federal investigators when everything fell apart at once. Nathan died in a car accident that no one could quite explain, and Philip died soon after, in the very fire that destroyed the Blackstone archive. Malcolm's own apartment was broken into, though nothing was taken except a single photograph of himself left deliberately on his kitchen table with 4 words written on the back. "You heard too much. Thomas met Malcolm at an abandoned train station and admitted he no longer knew who inside his own company could be trusted. He suggested that Malcolm disappear entirely, and when Malcolm refused, Thomas warned him plainly that staying Malcolm Vance would get him killed. Together they built a plan. Malcolm was declared dead, his professional history quietly erased from every database that mattered, and the Ghost Ledger investigation was frozen in place. Thomas then had Vault 7B constructed using the very same locking philosophy Malcolm himself had helped design years earlier, sealing every piece of remaining evidence inside a room that only two people alive could ever open. Thomas. Malcolm. When Malcolm asked why they had not simply handed everything to federal authorities, Thomas answered that he had no idea how deep the corruption actually ran inside his own institution. Back in the present, Rebecca asked whether her father had truly kept this evidence buried for 19 years, and Malcolm shook his head. He turned to the final page of the folder, a document far newer than the rest, dated only 17 days before Thomas Whitmore's death, and told her that her father had reopened the entire investigation shortly before he died. Rebecca stared at the analog recorder on the steel table, and when Vivian Mercer, her father's former personal secretary, was brought down to the sublevel, the older woman recognized the device, immediately explaining that Thomas never trusted cloud storage or email for anything that truly mattered. Vivian revealed that in the final weeks of his life, Thomas had come down to this level repeatedly, in the middle of the night, asking pointed questions about the overnight cleaning staff. Rebecca turned to Malcolm, who admitted he had never once spoken directly to Thomas during his 4 years working at the bank, though he had always suspected the old man had recognized him on a security monitor. When Rebecca asked why her father never simply reached out, Malcolm answered quietly that Thomas had known better than anyone that even cameras have ears. Rebecca pressed play on the recorder, and her father's voice filled the small room, weak and tired, but unmistakably clear. He explained that if she was hearing this recording, it meant he was no longer able to protect her himself, and that the Ghost Ledger had never truly disappeared, only gone dormant for a time. 3 years earlier, it had resurfaced in a far more sophisticated form, no longer skimming pennies from ordinary customers, but quietly funneling profits from subsidiary companies into private investment funds, a scheme now worth more than $214 million. Thomas had gathered partial evidence himself, but he made one fatal mistake, mentioning to a member of the board that he intended to revive the Blackstone investigation. 2 days after that conversation, the brakes on his car failed, though he survived. 3 months later, his heart medication was quietly swapped, and this time he did not survive at all. Rebecca stood frozen as the recording continued her father's official cause of death, having been ruled entirely natural. Derek suggested stopping the tape, but Rebecca insisted it keep playing, and Thomas's voice went on to say, there was one man who could finish what he had started, a name that landed like a thunderclap in that small stone room. Malcolm Vance. Every eye turned toward Malcolm, as Thomas's recorded voice instructed his daughter that if Malcolm Vance was ever standing in front of her, she should listen to every word he said. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She refused to let fall. And then her father's tone shifted, growing sharper, warning that if Graham Holt was still serving as chairman, she must not under any circumstances allow him to leave the Prater's building. At that exact moment, every light on the sublevel went dark, and in the blackness came the sound of metal clattering against concrete, followed by the muffled crack of a silenced gunshot. When the emergency lighting finally flickered back on, Graham Holt was gone, and so was the black folder bearing Malcolm's name. Derek immediately locked down the entire building, trapping 117 people inside its walls with no way in or out. The sublevel cameras had gone dark for exactly 43 seconds during the blackout, a detail that briefly cast suspicion on Malcolm himself, since he alone seemed to understand the building's hidden systems. Malcolm remained calm, crouching down to run his fingers along a faint streak of dust near the floor, before glancing up toward a ventilation grate. And when Derek asked what exactly he was doing, Malcolm simply said he was listening. He picked up an irregular vibration inside the ductwork and traced it to a fourth-floor exhaust fan that had been deliberately switched off, not to help anyone escape, but to mask the sound of a service elevator moving quietly above. Them. Malcolm guessed correctly that Graham had gone up to the 31st floor toward an old record storage room, and as the group moved to follow, Rebecca finally asked why a man with his history had chosen to spend 4 years mopping floors inside her father's own bank. Malcolm admitted he had never truly abandoned the investigation at all. A janitor, he explained, could pass through empty boardrooms after hours past the chief financial officer's office down technical corridors, through storage areas no executive ever bothered to notice, moving in a kind of silence that came from being beneath anyone's suspicion. People stopped talking the moment a chief executive walked into a room, he said, but they kept right on talking when he walked in instead. Across 4 quiet years, Malcolm had watched, listened, and remembered everything. He had noticed Warren Pike staying unusually late in his office nearly every Thursday night. Graham Holt riding a private elevator at 1 in the morning, like clockwork every quarter, and a shredder on the 29th floor, running nearly 300% more than any ordinary office required. He kept no written notes, no files, no photographs, because a man in his position could not risk leaving evidence of his own attention behind. Instead, he carried every detail in his memory, sorting it the same patient way. He once sorted the tumblers inside a lock, waiting for the one alignment that would finally make sense of the whole mechanism. He had gathered dozens of small disconnected threads, without ever finding the one piece that tied them together, until the vault itself became that missing piece. When the group finally reached the 31st floor, they found the storage room door locked, and as Derek prepared to force it open, Malcolm stopped him sharply. He heard a faint ticking sound. Not a bomb, but something worse. A fire suppression system that had been deliberately tampered with, ready to flood the sealed room with gas, capable of suffocating anyone trapped inside. Malcolm led them instead through a narrow technical access corridor, and when Rebecca insisted on coming along despite Derek's objections, she reminded them both that her father had died for whatever secret waited inside that room. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment, and simply told her to stay behind him. Once inside, they found no sign of Graham Holt, but the black folder sat waiting on a table beside a laptop, counting down from 4 minutes and 59 seconds. Malcolm studied the screen and said quietly that whoever was behind this was not trying to delete the evidence at all. When Rebecca asked what they were doing instead, his answer chilled the room. They were transferring every stolen dollar. The laptop screen displayed 17 separate international accounts, all of them quietly funneling $214 million into a single consolidated fund. Derek called for a cyber response team immediately, but Malcolm warned there was no time. Only 4 minutes remaining, and when Rebecca reached to simply pull the power cord, Malcolm stopped her, explaining that the ghost ledger had been built with a dead man's switch, one that would erase the entire transaction history the instant it lost connection. He turned instead to the schematics buried in the folder and realized Thomas had quietly installed something he called a physical reconciliation key. Because the ghost ledger had been born in an era when analog and digital systems still ran side by side, any full authentication still required a physical code drawn from an old mainframe buried down in the sublevel. The mainframe was not simply a relic, Malcolm realized with sudden clarity. The vault itself was part of the ghost ledger's own locking mechanism, and 38 seconds earlier, when Malcolm had opened it in front of the entire board, he had unknowingly triggered this very chain of transfers. Rebecca was stunned, asking if he was the one who had started all of this, but Malcolm assured her he had not, insisting that someone had been waiting all along for him to be the one to open that door. Someone had known Malcolm was still alive, had known he alone could unlock Vault 7B, and had deliberately arranged for the renovation crew to discover it for the hired specialists, to fail one after another, building the exact pressure needed to force him out of hiding. Rebecca asked who could possibly have engineered something so elaborate, and a voice answered from the doorway before anyone else could speak. Warren Pike stood there holding a gun with Graham Holt beside him, though Graham was clearly wounded in the shoulder, and not, as it turned out, the true architect of any of it. Graham had been part of the Ghost Ledger's earliest incarnation, but had tried to walk away from it 11 months earlier, and it was Warren who had quietly taken full control in his place. It was Warren who had spent nearly 3 years secretly confirming that the quiet janitor sweeping the lobby floors was in fact the long-dead Listener 4. Warren was the one who had ordered Thomas Whitmore's death, and then he had simply waited patient as a spider for Malcolm to finally open that vault himself. He had studied Malcolm's file for years, cross-referencing old contractor records, pension gaps, dental records, anything that might confirm what his instincts had already told him the first time. He passed the quiet janitor in a hallway and felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. 38 seconds, Warren said with a thin smile. Still impressive after all these years. Something in that voice struck Malcolm instantly. A memory from 19 years earlier, the same voice that had called him, the night Nathan Rourke died, a voice he had always attributed wrongly to Graham Holt. It had been Warren all along, a quiet, unremarkable young financial analyst back then. Someone nobody in that building had ever thought to watch closely. Invisibility, Warren said. With something close to admiration, you taught me that yourself. With barely a minute left on the countdown, Warren ordered Malcolm to finish the transfer, threatening to shoot Rebecca if he refused. Malcolm glanced once at the clock, then at Rebecca, and finally spoke with a calm that unsettled even Warren. You made one mistake, he said, and when Warren demanded to know what that mistake was, Malcolm simply told him he was wrong. To think the vault had been opened in 38 seconds, because Malcolm was fast. Malcolm explained that Vault 7B could have been opened in barely 21 seconds if speed had truly been the goal. The remaining 17 seconds had been deliberate, a carefully constructed sequence of small, seemingly random errors that triggered a set of decades-old mechanical sensors he and Thomas had built together long ago, a distress code known only within the old Blackstone network. 4, 9, 3, 7, 1. Warren laughed, insisting that Blackstone had died years earlier. But Malcolm answered simply that organizations could die while their protocols lived on. That signal had never gone to Blackstone at all. It had been quietly folded into a federal banking oversight system, built after the financial crisis of 2808, one that automatically flagged any high-level vault alert occurring alongside a transaction exceeding $200 million. Warren spun toward the laptop and, seeing the countdown ticking toward zero, fired wildly into the mainframe itself. Malcolm pulled Rebecca to the ground as Derek tackled Graham, and in the chaos that followed, Warren bolted for the service elevator while Rebecca screamed that he was getting away. Malcolm did not chase him. He simply watched the countdown fall. 8 seconds. 7, 6. As Warren disappeared behind closing elevator doors, and at 3 seconds, Malcolm closed his eyes entirely. At 0, nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed. And for a moment, it seemed as though Warren had simply won the transfer, marked complete, on the screen in front of them. $214 million gone. Rebecca stared at the destination account in disbelief. It traced to a small bank in Delaware, and when she read the name aloud, Malcolm allowed himself the first real smile of the entire night. It was her father's bank. He explained that Thomas had built the ghost ledger trap, so that the moment the old Blackstone distress code activated before any transfer completed, the routing itself would silently reverse. Warren had not moved a single stolen dollar out of the bank at all. He had unknowingly gathered 19 years of hidden theft into one single, fully traceable account, creating the complete unbroken record of evidence that Thomas himself had never been able to assemble while he was alive. Derek looked at the screen and said quietly that Malcolm had trapped him after all, and Malcolm shook his head, glancing once more at the old photograph of Thomas Whitmore resting on the table. No, he said. Thomas did. Outside, the thump of helicopter blades grew louder as a convoy of federal vehicles converged on the building. But Malcolm was not looking toward the window. He was staring instead at a single line, handwritten on the final page of the folder, words meant only for Rebecca. Tell Malcolm the truth about his name, it read. And Malcolm looked up at her sharply. What truth? He asked. Warren Pike was arrested in the parking garage before he ever made it off the property, and Graham Holt, wounded and cornered, surrendered without further resistance. Yet Rebecca remained inside Vault 7B, with Malcolm long after the agents had swarmed the building, and it was Vivian Mercer who was finally called back down to help make sense of that final handwritten line. When Rebecca showed her the note, Vivian broke into tears, explaining that Thomas had asked her to keep this particular secret until the ghost ledger was fully destroyed, no matter how long that took. Hidden inside a false compartment in the folder's spine, one Malcolm himself had missed entirely. Vivian carefully drew out an old legal document dated back to 2007. It was not another piece of investigative evidence at all. It was a founder's protective covenant, and it revealed that Thomas Whitmore had secretly transferred 4 8/10% of his own personal shares in the bank into a private trust years earlier, naming a single beneficiary, Malcolm Vance. The current value of that stake came to nearly $530 million, and Malcolm simply stared at the page in stunned silence. When Rebecca asked Vivian why her father had done this, Vivian played a second recording in which Thomas explained that Malcolm had effectively saved the bank back in 2007 because exposing the ghost ledger before there was complete evidence would have collapsed Whitmore Meridian entirely and cost thousands of ordinary employees their jobs. Malcolm had never accepted any money or shares in exchange for his silence and his sacrifice. He had asked Thomas for only one thing in return: that he protect whoever remained alive from the old Blackstone team. Thomas had failed to keep that promise in the years that followed, and so as a kind of overdue debt he quietly created the trust instead. But Malcolm could never legally claim it, while the world still believed Malcolm Vance had died 19 years earlier. So Thomas hid his name inside the vault itself, trusting that someday his daughter would be the one to find it. It had never been placed there because Malcolm was a suspect or a thief. It sat there because, in every legal sense that mattered, Malcolm Vance had quietly become one of the largest individual shareholders in the entire Whitmore Meridian Bank. Rebecca looked at his simple gray uniform and said almost in disbelief that he had spent years mopping the floors of a bank he partly owned without ever knowing it. Malcolm admitted quietly that he had never known it all. When Rebecca asked why he had never once reached out to her father after disappearing, Malcolm confessed that for a long time he had been angry believing Thomas had chosen the bank's survival over the lives of the men who died beside him. He had vanished into a string of anonymous jobs that required no deep background check, carrying the quiet shame of a man who felt he had run rather than fought, until one day he saw Whitmore Meridian advertising for overnight custodial staff, and something in him decided to go back. It was never about the money. Malcolm wanted to know once and for all whether Thomas had truly buried the truth or simply been waiting for the right moment to dig it back up. For 4 years he mopped floors, watched and waited, until he finally understood that Thomas had never given up at all. When Rebecca asked whether he could forgive her father now, Malcolm looked at the old photograph for a long moment before answering simply no. Then, after a pause that seemed to hold 19 years inside it, he added quietly that he understood him now, and that would have to be enough. Rebecca closed the folder gently and asked what he planned to do tomorrow, and Malcolm glanced toward the mop, still resting just outside the vault door. He said he would be back at work by 10 o'clock, and when Rebecca asked if that was really his usual shift, Malcolm shook his head slowly. No, he told her that was when the board meeting started. By 10 the next morning, the boardroom on the 44th floor held 18 seats, and a silence so heavy it felt physical. News of Warren Pike's arrest had not yet been made fully public, though Graham Holt had already agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors, and the Ghost Ledger investigation was rapidly expanding, with more than $214 million frozen pending a full federal audit that would eventually stretch back through decades of transactions. Rebecca walked in first, and behind her came Malcolm, still dressed simply without a tailored suit or a security detail trailing behind him. One board member asked almost reflexively why maintenance had been allowed into the meeting, and Rebecca did not bother to answer him directly. She set the black folder down on the long table and read the founder's protective covenant aloud. 4 8/10% ownership, full voting rights, and a special clause that activated automatically the moment fraud was proven. At the board level, Malcolm did not merely hold shares now. Because the Ghost Ledger scheme had been confirmed, he also held the legal authority to demand an emergency restructuring of the board itself. A stunned silence spread across the room as Malcolm quietly took the empty chair that had once belonged to Graham Holt, and rather than seeking revenge or clearing out the entire leadership in one sweep, he laid out three simple requests. Instead, first, an independent audit covering 19 full years of transactions. Second, complete restitution for every fund the Ghost Ledger had ever drained. Third, the creation of an internal integrity office that allowed even the lowest-ranking employees to report concerns directly, without ever having to go through a manager who might have every reason to bury the complaint. When a board member asked why that third request mattered so much, Malcolm answered that the most dangerous thing inside that building had never been the vault itself. It was the quiet, unspoken belief that certain people were simply too unimportant to notice anything at all. Rebecca understood exactly what he meant. Warren Pike had survived undetected for 19 years, precisely because leadership only ever paid attention to people with important titles, while Malcolm himself had survived because those same powerful people never once thought to look twice at the man pushing a mop past their offices. One older board member, a woman who had sat on that council for nearly 2 decades, admitted quietly that she had walked past Malcolm in that very hallway more times than she could count and had never once learned his name, and she said it not as an excuse, but as a confession. The kind of honesty that seemed to settle over the whole room like a held breath finally released. After the meeting ended, Rebecca found Malcolm back down in the sublevel, standing quietly in front of Vault 7B, his mop already carried off somewhere else entirely. She asked whether he intended to stay on at the bank, and Malcolm admitted honestly that he had not yet decided. Rebecca handed him a small box, and inside sat a brand new nameplate, reading Malcolm Vance, Director of Institutional Security and Integrity. Malcolm studied it for a moment, and Rebecca told him with a faint smile that the salary was considerably better than custodial work. When he asked exactly how much better, she named the figure, and Malcolm raised an eyebrow before noting dryly that it was still a good deal less than 4.8%. Rebecca laughed. The first real laugh either of them had allowed themselves in more than 24 exhausting hours, a sound that seemed to loosen something tight in both their chests, and Malcolm finally accepted the small box from her hands. Before he turned to leave, he looked back once more at Vault 7B, its door standing open now for anyone to walk through, and Rebecca asked quietly what exactly he was listening for now. Malcolm paused for a long moment before answering nothing at all. When she asked if that was a good thing, he allowed himself a small, tired smile and said it had been 19 years since he had heard nothing, and yes, it was very good indeed. 3 months later, Vault 7B was never torn down or converted into anything so simple as ordinary storage. Rebecca transformed it instead into a permanent archive holding every scrap of evidence from the Ghost Ledger case, and above its heavy steel door she had a small plaque installed that read simply the Vance Archive. It was not there to honor a wealthy shareholder or a powerful executive. It stood as a quiet reminder to every leader who passed through that sublevel that for 19 years, a man the entire financial world believed to be dead had spent more than 4 of those years mopping floors directly beneath the feet of people quietly stealing hundreds of millions of dollars. They had spoken freely in front of him. They had laughed in front of him. They had ordered him again and again to simply stay out of the way. And on the night Vault 7B finally opened, after 12 engineers had failed and 3 security firms had walked away in defeat, after a billion-dollar chief executive had nearly ordered him thrown out of her own building, Malcolm Vance had done nothing more dramatic than set down his mop, peel off a pair of rubber gloves, and take exactly 38 seconds to open a door that had guarded its secret for 19 long years. But what Rebecca Whitmore would never forget about that night was not how Malcolm opened the vault at all. It was the moment she looked inside and realized that the most invisible man in the entire building had all along held a name at the very center of the biggest secret her family's empire had ever kept.